get a confirmation from someone in the audience that they can hear my voice and see my screen. We have a great visual presentation tonight, so I want to confirm that everyone can see. Welcome. Welcome, welcome. And I am going to stick a link to tonight's event in the chat box. This also has the YouTube link so you can watch this again or share it with anyone. Also, as Lucy talks and if notes and things come up, I'll add those to the document if resources come up. Shall we get started while the room continues to fill up? Again, we want to thank you for being here and joining us on this beautiful San Francisco night. It's gorgeous out. I want to fix my slide. There we go. San Francisco Public Library acknowledges that we occupy the unceded ancestral home of the Ramaytush Ohlone people, who are the original inhabitants of the San Francisco Peninsula. We recognize that the Ramaytush Ohlone understand the interconnectedness of all things and have maintained harmony with nature for millennia. We honor the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples for their enduring commitment to Warep, Mother Earth, and the indigenous protectors of this land in accordance with their traditions. The Ramaytush Ohlone have never ceded, lost, nor forgotten their responsibilities as caretakers of this place, as well as for all people who reside in the traditional territory. We recognize that we benefit from living and working on their traditional homeland. As uninvited guests, we affirm their sovereign rights as First Peoples and wish to pay our respects to the ancestors, elders, relatives of the Ramaytush community. We recognize to respectfully honor the Ramaytush peoples, we must embrace and collaborate meaningfully to record Indigenous knowledge and how we care for San Francisco and its people. And that link that I shared in the chat box has a link to a great reading and resource list about first person culture here in the Bay Area and some great resources you can find out. And now just some quick library news that we have coming up. Tomorrow night, we have another author talk, Ed Fuller and Gary Grossman, talking about their latest book from their Red Hotel series, Red Deception. On September 29th, the amazing Zizova, which is Letters and Journals from San Francisco, issue number 121, the family issue, and we'll have the readers featured from that issue. So please come check that out. We're so excited to have this. I am excited. Have loved Zizova for a very long time. On the 30th at noon, we partner with Museum of African Diaspora for Wole Soyinka. And this is part of a series they have going on called Conversations Across the Diaspora. So a noontime event, always fun. We are celebrating Viva Latinx Heritage Month. And on Thursday night, come to the library. You can actually come in person and we will have a nice spread out event. You must wear your mask, but we will have the organizers and activists from International Flor y Canto, who is working to preserve and highlight the literary arts on the 24th Street corridor here in our Mission neighborhood. So we'll hear about their work, but we'll also hear their readings, and there will be books available. So please come check that out. And if you can't make it in person, we will also be streaming. This will be our first hybrid event. So either way, come down, watch online, cut us some slack when we screw up, and we'll have such a great time. And some more Viva. We have Jaime Cortez on Sunday. We have Carolina de Robertas and Julian Delgato on Thursday. I want to say that's a Thursday. It might be a Wednesday. A Tuesday, the 28th. It's going to be so fun. They're both amazing humans. So come check that out. And just lots of authors coming up. Laura Gomez on Inventing Latinos. And then another in-person event. And I have the wrong time on here. It's actually at 6 p.m. in the Latinx community rooms on our lower level of the main library. Very fun book. So they're going to be talking about their Bay Area history, being punk rock, and having family and teaching and living in the Bay Area. So please come on down. And then in October, we hit off Filipino American History Month, and we'll have a ton more events for that as well. And last thing I want to bring up is our On the Same Page, which is a bi-monthly read at San Francisco Public Library, where I encourage you all to read the same book. For September and October, we're celebrating the work of Carla Cornejo Villavicencio, and she will be in convo with Jonathan Blitzer on the 26th. The day before that, we have the book club. This book is now available widely at all library locations, or check it out from your favorite local bookstore. And then in November, we have at the Corette Auditorium. So you can see we're going back into business in person. Total SF, our friends from the Chronicle, highlighting Bonnie Swee's book, Why We Swim. Why we swim specifically in the Bay. All right, so without further ado, I would like to introduce tonight's author and speaker. So we're very fortunate tonight to have Lucy Antek Johnson, Samuel Antek's daughter. She was born and raised in New York City. After studying music, fine art, and ballet, she was drawn to the world of television production and spent her entire career in the entertainment industry, working with such producers as Martin Charnin, Harry Belafonte, David Susskind, and Roone Arledge. When she moved to Los Angeles in 1978, she produced movies for television, then joined NBC as a network executive. She soon worked her way up to Senior Vice President of Daytime and Children's Programming for CBS, a position she held for 14 years. She paints, writes, and every so often gets up the nerve to sit at the piano and play a favorite Bach or Chopin prelude. And we are excited, like I said, to have Lucy with us. And Lucy, I'm going to let you take it away.
Well, thank you so much. What a nice introduction, and what a pleasure to sort of be visiting San Francisco tonight. I'm in Connecticut. So welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming. Tonight, I'm going to share some highlights from my new book, which you're seeing the cover here, as well as show a few photos along the way. But I'll start with a little story. So we can click to the next photo, please, number 2. Here it is. So for as far back as I can remember, Arturo Toscanini's autographed picture sat atop our Steinway piano in my family's New York City apartment. And to this day, many decades later, it still occupies a place of honor on the same piano, now right over there in my Connecticut living room. And although I wasn't even born when the NBC Symphony was formed, and I only have a dim memory of seeing the maestro across a crowded rehearsal hall, I was sitting quiet as a mouse clutching my mother's hand. Arturo Toscanini was a central figure in our home. Next picture, please. My father, Samuel Antek, this is not my father, this is Toscanini. My father, Samuel Antek, was only 29 when he, already a violin virtuoso, was handpicked to be a first violinist with the new NBC Symphony, an orchestra especially created for Toscanini, who was often referred to as the greatest musician of the 20th century. Toscanini had, by that point, attained a pinnacle of honor and success matched by few musicians of any era. In fact, I would say by today's standards, he would literally be called a rock star. Now we can change to the book picture, which is, I think, number 4, yeah. Today, it's my pleasure to share my labor of love with you. This is it. This Was Toscanini, the Maestro, My Father, and Me. And the main title, This Was Toscanini, is my father's acclaimed memoir, which was originally published years ago, in which he shares his musical insights and observations about his 17 years playing under Toscanini's legendary baton. It's not a biography. It's an intimate, behind-the-scenes, and highly illuminating portrait of the maestro, his music, and his creative process, told from the unique perspective of a musician lucky enough to play under his baton in over hundreds of rehearsals and concerts and innumerable recording sessions. My father brings alive the work that made those memorable concerts possible. And he takes us right inside the almost 2 decades of performances, and we feel as if we're sitting among the players of the orchestra, experiencing firsthand, as they experienced, what inspired the maestro's dynamic approach to a score, his conducting style, and what triggered his explosive passions. So I like to say it's though we were invited into a master class with an artistic genius. But also in this new and expanded edition, as the subtitle suggests, The Maestro, My Father and Me, I'm the Me, I've added newly written intros to my father's original narrative. And in them, I share my own recollections about my mom, my dad, his illustrious career as a violinist and conductor, and the impact that the maestro had on our family during such a memorable time in classical music history. It's a memoir wrapped in a memoir, or a musical love story, if you like. Next picture, please. Number 5, yeah. So you might be curious what inspired me to reissue his book at this time. Well, actually, a couple of years ago in 2017, it was the 150th anniversary of Toscanini's birth. And of course, many articles and books were published about the maestro and his legacy. And the book that stood out for me was Harvey Sachs' celebrated biography, Toscanini, Musician of Conscience. And what particularly moved me was that Harvey quoted passages directly from my father's original memoir. So I was absolutely thrilled and proud to see my dad's elegant writing in print once again. And it inspired me to reread the original This Was Toscanini, which I had not read in many years. And once I read it, I just knew that Toscanini's art was still relevant. After all, great art is timeless. And I knew my father's words deserved a renewed life. So now was the time to introduce this book to new generations of musicians, students, and classical music fans. I also knew in this new edition and what I was going to write that I wanted to include material about my family and bring my father more center stage, because his story deserved to be told as well. So off I went, spending hours in my dad's archives, which I had donated to the New York Public Library at Lincoln Center. And also in our basement, there were many cartons marked Sam or Toscanini, filled with letters, photos, recordings. And it's not that I hadn't seen these items before, but when you're looking with a new focus, all of a sudden things jump out at you that have so much meaning. And it quickly became a very deeply emotional journey. Because tragically, my father had died very young, just as he was achieving his own recognition as a conductor. He was only 49 and I was only 12. And overnight, our little family was upended. The music world might have lost a rising star, but I had lost my hero. So in my research, reading his handwritten notes, hearing his voice on recordings, watching him playing on old TV broadcasts, or even holding a favorite photo again, had a profound impact on me. It was, I would call it a sweet sadness. You can actually change now to number 6. Thanks. Next photo, yeah. I'm going to quote Maestro Riccardo Muti, who's now the conductor of the Chicago Symphony, because he wrote something about Toscanini, and I quote, "Toscanini was a revolutionary of musical interpretation. He placed the performer totally at the service of the composer in sacred respect for and fidelity to the written text," unquote. Toscanini benefited throughout his life from he had a very photographic memory. In fact, through the course of his career, he knew 120 operas and over 400 symphonic works by heart. Yet, he always referred to his score, you can see in the picture, he's looking at his score, during rehearsals, and always encouraged his players not to memorize the music. His credo was, play what is written, look to the score. And as many of you probably know, conducting is infinitely more than just keeping a tempo and cueing the entrance of a player. It's a fine art of genius and interpretation of a score. And just as an actor interprets a role by a playwright or a dancer interprets a choreographer's work, So a conductor shapes the musical performance of a composer. How loud is forte? How soft is pianissimo? How many beats to build the crescendo? That's up to the conductor. But they can't create their art on their own. A conductor needs a composer's score, musicians, and of course, instruments. And for Toscanini, the orchestra was his instrument. Next picture, please. Number 7, yeah. So for those who might need a refresher, or for those who may not know at all, who was Toscanini and what propelled him to this exalted place in music history? He was born into a working class family in Parma, Italy in 1867. And at 18, he graduated from the Parma Music Conservatory as an accomplished cellist. And at 19, he became principal cellist and assistant chorus master for an Italian opera company touring Brazil. And it was on that tour that a historic twist of fate changed the course of his future and classical music history. Because right at the start, the tour conductor abruptly resigned. And Toscanini, with his photographic memory of all the operas in their repertoire, was thrust upon the stage to take over. And once he held the baton and took command, he never looked back. And in his 20s, he revolutionized the production and performance of opera throughout Italy. And by 30, he was principal conductor at La Scala in Milan, conducting the Italian premieres of operas that are still the foundation of repertoires today, including La Bohème, Turandot, Pagliacci, just to name a few. So not only did his music make headlines, but his politics made headlines. His single-minded and almost stubborn personality not only reflected his devotion to music, but gave him the strength to stand up to Mussolini and Hitler. Toscanini refused to play in Germany once Hitler came into power, and years earlier in Italy, with the rise of fascism, he refused to play the fascist party hymn, Giovinezza, which Mussolini required be played at all public events, but he wouldn't do it. So there were consequences. In Bologna in 1931, after one performance where once again, he did not play the anthem, he and his wife were brutally attacked and beaten by a fascist mob as they left the theater, all because they claimed he was unpatriotic. And from then on, Toscanini vowed not to play in Italy until the fascist regime fell. And even though he was regarded as a national treasure in his own country, his fame and status only protected him to a point. He was kept under strict surveillance by the fascists. They tapped his phones, they took his passports away every so often, and even threatened imprisonment. And yet he remained vocal in his democratic beliefs and kept performing throughout Europe, Israel, and the United States. And just as life for him in Italy was becoming more challenging, in 1936, David Sarnoff, RCA's chairman of the board, and RCA owned the NBC radio network. Sarnoff made the dramatic commitment to create a new orchestra. When Toscanini agreed to sign on as the conductor, Sarnoff knew it would be the jewel in the crown of the NBC schedule, as well as for their recording division. So the following year, at age 70, when most people are considering retirement, Toscanini made a life-changing choice. He left his beloved Italy. He took his family to the United States, to New York, and they inaugurated the NBC Symphony. The concerts were broadcast live from Studio 8H in the NBC studios on Saturday nights. I was too young to attend, but I remember listening to them on the radio each week. Next picture, please. Program, yeah. This is the program of the opening night. The debut concert was Christmas night, 1937. And by the way, the programs such as this were never printed on paper. This one is silk. So they were all printed either on silk or on cardboard or on cork, because the mics, they didn't want the mics to pick up the rustling of papers during a live broadcast. And just to give you a little idea of how popular he was at that time, there were 1,400 available seats for that first concert, and there were 23,000 requests for tickets, telling you he was a rock star. So what was the first rehearsal with the maestro really like? Well, on that memorable day, the musicians, they were very nervous and they sat rigidly waiting for him to appear. They were about to begin their first rehearsal. for their premiere performance under the baton of one of the most famous men in the world. They were about to make history, no pressure. And when Toscanini walked in and crossed to the podium, the musicians spontaneously all stood in unison. They had been warned in advance not to make any verbal acknowledgement. So he nodded to the assembled players for them to sit, and without any formal greeting, called out, "Brahms!" and they dove into the music. Next picture, please. Thank you. I'm going to quote, just a little quote of my father's writing about that first rehearsal. In one smashing stroke, the baton came down, a vibrant sound gushed forth. Was this the same music we had been practicing so assiduously for days? With what fierce new joy we played. So, the maestro bellowed, cantare, sostenere, sing, sustain, Toscanini's battle cry. This was the first time these words were flung at us, and for 17 years, we lived by them, unquote. In the book, my father shares detailed accounts of how grueling so many of the rehearsals could be. They might spend a half hour on a particular string entrance, or in one instance, they played the opening bars of Beethoven's Sixth over and over and over until the music on the page, the sound from the players, and what Toscanini heard in his head all meshed perfectly. Next picture, please. Yeah, Toscanini had a plaintive cry, play with your hearts, not your instruments. But the process could be dramatic. And as congenial and social as he was offstage, in rehearsals, he was sometimes tyrannical and well known for his artistic temperament. And he was famous, or you might say infamous, for his use of Italian curses if a particular sequence wasn't meeting his exacting standards and standards that he was setting for himself. Next picture. There he is in rage mode. Vergogna, shame, was one of his favorites, also the most tame. And un pasticcio, it's a mess, was another favorite. And my father would bring home some more earthy curses at the end of a tough rehearsal day. And as my father said, there were two Toscaninis, the peasant at rehearsals and the aristocrat at concerts. So what would set off these outbursts? Sometimes the simplest little error, a note too loud, a crescendo too soon, anything was enough to set off the fuse. And so often it was about his own feeling about his own work. And my father writes about quite a few of these memorable flare-ups, but again, I will quote one of them. If you would switch the picture, please. Quote, one of his most violent displays of temper concerned nothing more than two grace notes that had not been articulated in Wagner's Tannhauser Overture, a momentous crime in Toscanini's eyes. He was known to break his baton, tear up a score, rip up his jacket, or stomp off in disgust. Dramatic, stagey, yes, but every movement of his baton, every motion of his hands, every burst of rage served music, and the musicians loved him for it. My father believed that as tough as the maestro was on them, they became better musicians because of it. And as the maestro was known to say, and I'll throw in a little Italian, quoting the maestro, any asino can conduct, but to make music is difficile. So change the picture, please. We're changing to my dad now. Who was Samuel Antek? What were his dreams and his challenges? He actually reveals very little about himself in the memoir. So in my new essays, I take the opportunity to show a more complete picture of him and his musical career. He grew up in Chicago, and at age 6, he was recognized as a prodigy. So his parents, who didn't have much money, scraped together the most they could to get him the best teachers in Chicago. But by the time he was in his late teens, he knew he had to move to New York. And he studied with a very famous violin teacher, Leopold Auer, and received a fellowship to Juilliard, and he was soon concertizing. His big debut was at Town Hall, and a few months later, he was invited into the elite group of musicians hired to be in the original NBC Symphony. This picture happens to be the official photograph from the first year of the orchestra. But he had always had a dream to conduct, and he had conducted some small ensembles. But interestingly, similar to the maestro's twist of fate story, or like a story out of a Hollywood movie, He got his first real chance on a radio show when, during a rehearsal for his violin solo, the conductor got sick and my father was asked to take over. And Dad ended up conducting the whole season and maybe the next couple of seasons, I believe. So from that point on, he knew he wanted to pursue his goal of conducting more seriously. He wanted to lead a major orchestra. Next picture, please. Yeah. His dream came true. And at the age of 39, with the support and encouragement of Toscanini, and without having to give up his seat at NBC, he was named conductor and musical director of the New Jersey Symphony Orchestra, and he held both positions for many, many years. And in the book, I illustrate more fully the lasting impact that he had on the New Jersey Symphony. But to my young eyes at the time, his crowning achievements were the interactive children's concerts, which he innovated in 1950, a few years before Leonard Bernstein, I might add. And each weekend it was a sellout event attracting kids from all over New Jersey. And sometimes I'd sit in the audience, but sometimes I'd stand in the wings, but wherever I was beaming with "that's my daddy" pride, I call it. His reputation grew rapidly, and soon he was guest conducting major orchestras around the country. But the biggest honor was when Arturo Toscanini invited my father to guest conduct the NBC Symphony, and he knew his own future was sealed. I used to love, as I grew older, I became more curious, and I used to love sitting next to him at the piano when he prepared a score for an upcoming concert that he was conducting. I'd watch him unfold the mysterious and magical sheets of musical notepaper depicting all the instrumental and choral parts, and he'd play a chord, make a notation, he'd play another chord, make another notation. I was absolutely fascinated. It was my first introduction to how complex that process was. Next slide, please. So This Was Toscanini, this new book, includes much more about what it was like to grow up in a house with my dynamic father, but it also covers many other dimensions of the maestro's personality and professional story, not just what he was like in the rehearsal hall. In the Touring with Toscanini section, my father tells of their triumphant cross-country tour in 1950. And I, after discovering my mother's journal and photos detailing the orchestra's 6-week 1940 wartime South American tour, she describes the fears on the high seas as they sailed into Nazi territory. And Toscanini would walk around the deck fingering a crucifix, praying for the Allies. He wouldn't see Italy again for many years. There's a fascinating chapter on the painstaking process of the NBC Symphony recording sessions, because don't forget, it was a whole different technology in the early days. And one of my favorite chapters is The Visit, where my father shares his rare and memorable afternoon visiting with the maestro in his home. And they indulged in lengthy conversations about composers, especially Verdi, who Toscanini had known when he was a cellist and an opera conductor. Verdi was a contemporary, as was Puccini, by the way. So for my father, it was his own private masterclass that afternoon. And the last chapter, Toscanini's Conduct Oberon, is a feast for musicians. It's a bar-by-bar journey of Maestro's unique interpretation of Weber's Oberon Overture. It's a good read, whether you're a musician or pro or an enthusiast. So sadly, Dad passed away before he could write the final chapter. We don't know would it have been a quick wrap up or a more lengthy essay. We'll just never know. However, in my research, as I dug through these boxes, I discovered some of his never before published handwritten notes that to me indicate what he might have chosen to write about, and he had titled it NBC Final Concert. Next picture, please. Yeah. The story goes that during what was planned to be the symphony's last concert of the season in April 1954, Toscanini faltered in the middle of the program and just stopped conducting. The orchestra absolutely didn't know what to do. The studio audience was stunned. The engineers in the recording thing, they panicked and they put on a whole other recording to cover up. So therefore the audience at home was completely baffled. And it was a harrowing few minutes until Toscanini rallied and was actually able to complete the program, but he wasn't his usual powerful self. And I'm going to read to you just a few lines from what my father wrote, but had never been published. So I quote, "As our beloved 87-year-old maestro left the stage, dazed and tottering, he pushed past me and the baton dropped from his hand. It was to be the last of his conducting in public," unquote. Toscanini died a few years later in January 1957, shortly before his 90th birthday. And coincidentally, it was almost exactly a year to the day before my father died, just before his 50th birthday. So how did it get published finally? My mother was determined to publish his existing manuscript. She didn't want to write anything extra. And she joined forces with photographer Robert Hupka, who has taken these beautiful portraits that you've seen tonight. He took actually thousands of candid photographs throughout the years at rehearsals and recording sessions, and without the maestro's knowledge. So those portraits have since become the most iconic photos of the maestro used throughout the world, which you've probably seen on record albums. And when the first edition of my father's memoir was published posthumously in 1963, New York Times critic Edward Downes stated, quote, "This book will probably remain the most enduring and endearing monument to the art of Toscanini," unquote. And I've got to say, to this day, it remains the only full-length narrative from a musician's perspective about Toscanini's creative process and what it felt like to work with and be mentored by this unique and gifted artist. Next picture. Well, during this emotional journey of writing and compiling this book, I not only was able to renew a long overdue relationship with my father after many years, but I enjoyed getting to know him through the eyes of an adult rather than just the adoring young daughter. Next picture. This is my favorite. He's coming off stage after a concert and he's glowing and he's full of joy. And actually, this is how I remember him, that smile. Next picture. Yeah, this is the two of them in conversation. During this process, I also developed a soft spot for the maestro. He was no longer just that imposing figure staring down from our piano top. This irascible, musically brilliant, politically courageous, and shy force of nature was someone I would have loved to have known, truly loved to have known. I really got to feel very close to him. So in closing, I hope I've given you a taste of this new edition. And the next picture, here's the book cover again. This was Toscanini, the maestro, my father and me. It's my loving tribute to two musicians whose paths fortuitously crossed and whose individual gifts inspired each of them in their lifelong quest to make beautiful music. Thank you. Jeannie.
Thank you, Lucy. That was so great. And audience, I know I always forget to announce there is time for Q&A, and you can either put that in the Q&A box or you can feel free to raise your hand if you'd like. We can unmute you. But we do have 2 questions there now. That gives our other audience members some time to think of some questions. Our first question is, I'm curious about your day-to-day life, what your day-to-day life was like living with a musician. And was your mom a creative?
Yes, she was very creative. She was a trained artist and a professional artist, but she also played the piano. So I was surrounded. I was an only child. It was a musical household, but it was fun. And yes, I'd have to tiptoe around and be quiet, and we'd have to whisper when I'd come home from school because he was practicing behind closed doors. And we respected that. But there were a lot of impromptu musicals. My mom would be invited to play the piano, and some of the string players from the NBC Symphony would gather on a Sunday at the house, and they would have their own musicale for themselves. So, and WQXR, which is the local NPR station here, that was on all the time. So music was in the home, but there was no pressure on me. I studied the piano when I was very young. But once I discovered art, because I had a talent for it, and once I really discovered ballet, which I loved, each thing I kind of put to the side until the next interest. And although I majored in art in college, I knew I wanted television production. So there was no pressure to be in the arts, but I am I'm proud, and I remember very well the musical feeling in the home.
Thank you. And then we have a question about how did you decide that you wanted to do this book? And how did you pursue a publisher?
Well, I described in my chat how I was inspired by seeing my father's words in print in 2017, when a lot of his passages from his book had been reprinted in other books and in articles, because this book is still considered the pinnacle, the bellwether of anything you want to know about what it was really like to work with the maestro. So therefore, it's still quoted. And actually, in some music schools, it's still used in courses. Parts of it are referred to in courses. So I was secure that his words were worthy of coming back and being renewed. And that also, as I've said, art is timeless, and Toscanini was an artistic genius. And boy, oh boy, it was time that his work and his contribution, which was recognized by his own colleagues. I mean, George Zell, who was the conductor of the Cleveland Symphony, used to say, or had said, there was before Toscanini and after Toscanini. So even his peers, whether at the time or in retrospect, honored that he was numero uno there. He was the one to admire. I didn't know how I was going to publish it. I just knew I was determined. And I figured it was going to be self-publishing because I didn't really know. And I could have spent years pursuing a mainstream publisher, but I wanted to live to see this done. And I can understand why the major publishers would find this maybe a little too niche for them, for the audience. And through my attorney, I met a wonderful agent, very lucky, because that does not always happen. And she fell in love with the project too. And she said, would I consider a hybrid publisher, which I didn't know what that meant. And Brown Books, who published the book, is a hybrid publisher. And what that means, yes, it's a beautiful book. What that means is they provide all the services, design, sales, editing, so forth, that a mainstream publisher would provide, but the author contributes to the cost. So it's a step above normal self-publishing. And lucky me, the minute they read the manuscript, which by the way, they didn't change a word of what I had written, which thrilled me and surprised me actually. They put commas in where they needed to be, but they didn't really ask for changes or took commas out, because I have a terrible abundant use of too many commas. But and we made the deal almost exactly a year ago to the date. And then it took all this time to put the design together, which I was part of. I was part of all the process. And this was all through COVID. So I had the time, and I was pleased to have a creative project to work on during the whole lockdown, those lockdown months. And by then, everybody was doing everything online. Where normally I might have flown to Texas, where the publisher is, to meet with them. Well, that wasn't going to happen. So we did it all online, and voila, here it is. I think it's gorgeous. It got published a month ago, officially released, and it's gotten wonderful response. I couldn't be more pleased with the response from civilians and professionals. I don't hear you.
Yes. Sorry.
Ah.
I said it's a very beautiful book. It's a little mildly oversized, but not like oversized. And we do have it on order for SFPL, so you can place your hold and get it. It's very gorgeous. Like Lucy said, it just came out, so hot off the press. I'm curious about the photographs of Toscanini and the photographer you mentioned. So who owns those photos?
They are under copyright by Robert Hooker's estate. And even though they were all part of the original book, I had to get the permission of the estate, which I did, to use a fraction of what's used in the original book. And then I also had all my own photographs from my own archives, family photographs or my father's photographs or other Toscanini behind the scenes photographs that
Uh-oh. Is everyone else having an uh-oh? Whoop, you got a little frozen there for a second.
I'm here. Okay.
There we go.
Yeah. And I'm right next to my Wi-Fi, so I don't know.
Oh, it's the name of the game. It really is.
I know.
Now, I mean, there's so many perks to being online and being on Zoom and being able to have you from Connecticut, which is a very big perk. When you donated the photos had you already donated your photos to NY Public and then went back?
It wasn't the photos. I donated 10 what turned out to be 10 boxes of memorabilia.
Wow.
That included all the drafts of this book, handwritten drafts, letters from my dad's career, both with New Jersey and NBC, a lot of information about the NBC Symphony, photographs that I hadn't seen before, again, letters, reviews, just a whole mass of wonderful, wonderful material that, yes, although I had donated, I hadn't looked at for 10 years until I went back to the library.
That's really amazing. So you had to check out your own material.
Yes. Well, I couldn't even check it out. I had to sit in
Have
one of those private rooms.
Yeah, have they already processed it and like?
Yeah. I had donated it. Now it's about 15 years ago. So by now, my gosh, I hope they would have processed it. And yes, they had organized it beautifully.
Oh, beautiful. Love to hear. That's so nice.
By the way, in the same library at Lincoln Center is Toscanini's archives. So now we're working out a way together to do something in the spring to celebrate both, just as this book does. But how can we do that? So we're talking about how to do that.
So do you think that, the NBC influence and the TV aspect influenced your career choice?
You mean the NBC Symphony thing? It didn't influence it, in fact, because I was lucky enough to get a job. My first job actually was in the record library of NBC Radio. And it wasn't because that I was the daughter of, but it enhanced my position and my status for people who had worked there during the concert years. And when I would go up in the elevators at 30 Rock to my office, this was the early days, and I would walk through those beautiful marble halls. If any of you have been in Radio City, the RCA building, I would say, gee, this was where my father and Toscanini took the same elevator. How exciting. So it was more personal than maybe the hook of why I got hired. No. And I worked my way up in television, which really was quite a diversion.
That must have felt amazing to walk the same.
It did.
That's amazing. All right, friends, do we have any more questions for Lucy? And the questions we can take from YouTube as well. And as I mentioned, you can check out Lucy's book from us or buy from your favorite local bookstore.
Or Amazon.
Or there too.
It's a great gift. I've got to say, it sounds like I'm doing a pitch for myself, but it's a small version of a coffee table book. And
Yeah,
even though the narrative is fascinating and compelling and captivating, it's also a beautiful visual, and it's a lovely gift for anyone who likes music.
So did you hire a graphic designer to help you with the layout? Because
that was all part of the Brown Books hybrid. And we worked very closely because I knew that I wanted the photographs to illustrate what I was talking about in the text. I don't lump them all together. Yeah. So each time you see a photograph, it's referring to something that I've just written about or that my dad had written about. And so we worked together on the design. Yeah, that's my father conducting the New Jersey Symphony. Yeah, so we worked very closely, but they have all those services, and I mean, my hat's off to the work they did. I think it was beautiful, and it's on very good stock, paper stock, so that these reproductions come off, I believe, very well, and it's I don't know, it's classy. I don't know what other word to use right now.
It's definitely classy. It's definitely. And with the holidays coming, you better get your books quickly, as from what I hear. One question from the chat was, any wild stories from TV land?
Wild, I mean my own wild stories? Probably. It's hard to come up with, one of my career experiences, I was in charge of all the soap operas of CBS. And I don't know if any of you watch. I used to love soap operas. And these were the days when everybody watched soap operas. So you had all the backstage gossip of the stories and the characters, and we'd sit with the writers and figure out who's going to be married, who's not going to be married, who's coming back from the dead, because of course they had to bring people back. They were really stuck in a jungle. They hadn't died at all. They were going to come back. And those were fascinating years, working on, 4 soap operas, 52 weeks a year of live programming. Not live, but I mean of fresh programming every day. 30 characters each program, so that's a lot of stories. I also did the children's programming, and in one incarnation, I was one of the people who put the Smurfs on television.
Oh,
so I can remember that. I wasn't, it was certainly part of the decision. I was in the room where it happened, as Lin-Manuel would say. So there were definitely moments, but Bob Barker, I worked with him for years and years. He was the host of The Price is Right. And he became very good friend. And you just meet the most wonderful people. I mentioned Harry Belafonte in or you did actually. I did a lot of work with Harry on his television specials early on. And we became very, very close friends. And I was just very lucky, the people I met, and it was a diverse production experience.
It definitely sounds like a very exciting life, Lucy, both growing up and growing out and doing your own. And so we want to thank you for being here tonight, friends. And last call for questions. Absolutely, we will stay here for questions if you have them. Otherwise, we encourage you to check out or buy Lucy's book, This Was Toscanini.
Can I give them the name of the address from my website?
Sure, I've put it into the chat box already, but let me throw it up again. Here it is. And here it comes along the chat. There we go. Oops, I'm just really pushing that you check it out at the library. My bad. My excuse.
No, I agree with you.
There we go.
Libraries rule, as far as I'm concerned.
There's Lucy's website, beautiful website as well. Congratulations.
And you can ask questions through the website as well.
Excellent. Oh, there is a hand raised. I'm going to go ahead and unmute you, Marina. Here we go. I'm going to try. My cursor's not moving. Lily May, can you help me unmute? Thank you. You are unmuted.
I'm drinking.
Or you could be. I don't know why my chat box, I can't move my cursor to that window for some reason. There we go. There we go. Marina, would you like to ask your question?
I think she's muted.
I'm trying to unmute here.
There we go.
Here we go. Hello, Lucy. What a
Hello.
wonderful book. And I just want to ask you, what was your impression? I know you were a child when Toscanini was alive, but how did you, what was your impression of him as a
Well,
person?
he was bigger than life to me. I was a very little person, and it was more about him being talked about and the reputation and the awe in which people spoke of him that I'm left with. And also the conversations around the dinner table when my father would come home from one of the recording sessions or rehearsals, I would just sop all that up. I mean, my goodness. So I, as I said, that autographed picture really still sits on my piano, and he inspires me. And as I said at the end of my talk, getting to know him better through this writing process and actually reading some of Toscanini's letters where you hear his voice, his opinions, not just people about him. I just got a big crush on this guy. And I really, really, really would have liked to have known him or to have been in the room with him. I'm glad I wasn't in his line of fire if he got angry. But he was not a mean guy. He was frustrated. It was a rage to master. He was just so frustrated. This is a little scary to look at.
Yeah, and a perfectionist, I'm sure.
Yeah, but mostly the pressure was the pressure he put on himself.
Yeah.
Once he developed a sound for a particular piece or whatever it is, it's not that he stayed rigid with that piece and said, this is the way it's going to be forever. Each time he played it, he would rethink it and reinterpret it. And maybe I'll make this a little, darker or lighter. It's like a painter or a sculptor, So he was constantly being creative. And that was appreciated. That's very much evident in the last chapter about Oberon, because my father sort of compiles the years of them playing that piece and the different ways that Toscanini would approach it at different times, along with a lot more anecdotes. So
I love this picture of your father.
I love it. It's my favorite thing.
Yeah, he looks definitely like he exerted it.
He was it. He was happy there.
Yeah, he looked very happy. And I'm just going to also throw in the chat if we forgot to list those YouTube videos that you recommended yesterday, Lucy.
Oh, yeah.
And, you can all just pick this doc up and find all these links, but I'm going to throw those in there right now. Verdi's Hymn of the Nations.
Hymn of Nations, yeah.
Hymn of Nations. This one calls it Hymn of the Nations, Hymn of the Nations. All right, yeah. All right, Lucy and friends, library community, always we thank you for joining us tonight and being.
Well, thank you. It was a pleasure.
Absolutely.
Visiting you. And I think I'll go to bed now.
Yes, it's late. Thank you so much.
Good night.
All right,
Thank
friends,
you.
have a good one. Thank you, Lily May, and thank you, Lucy. Have a good night.